The day my mother was buried, my wife patted my hand and said, "Don't worry, I've already taken care of everything." I didn't ask what she meant by that. I should have, but I was 63 years old, standing at the edge of a grave in the November cold, and I thought I understood grief better than I understood my own marriage. I was wrong about that. I had been wrong about a great many things for a very long time. My name is Walter. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer before I retired, and before that, for nearly a decade that most people in my life don't know about. I worked as a contract analyst for a federal oversight division that investigated financial misconduct in public infrastructure projects. I wore a hard hat to work. I reviewed blueprints. I also reviewed bank records, procurement ledgers, and shell company registrations. I was very good at it. And then I walked away, moved back to Virginia, married a woman named Carol who laughed at all my quiet jokes, and I told myself that chapter of my life was finished. I want you to understand something before I continue. I am not a dramatic man. I never have been. My daughter used to say I had the emotional range of a parking meter, and she wasn't entirely wrong. I don't raise my voice. I don't slam doors. When something is wrong, I tend to go quiet and still, the way a river goes quiet before it floods. I had been going quiet for a long time before any of this came to a head. People around me mistook that quiet for weakness, for disinterest, for a man who had simply checked out of his own life. Carol certainly did. And for a while, even my daughter did. My mother's name was Dorothy. She was 81 years old when she passed, sharp as a tack right up until the last 2 years when the dementia came in quietly, the way most terrible things do. She had a house in Charlottesville, a Victorian she and my father had bought in 1971 for $43,000, and which by the time she died was worth somewhere north of $800,000. She had a portfolio of municipal bonds she'd been collecting since the 1980s. She had a savings account she'd never touched, money set aside, she told me once, for my children and their children. She had a life, carefully built, carefully preserved, and then Carol got involved. I want to be precise about when it started because I've had a long time to think about it, and precision matters to me. It started about 4 years before my mother died, when my mother's memory began slipping. Carol offered to help manage her appointments. My mother was grateful. I was grateful. Carol is organized, capable, charming when she wants to be, and she wanted to be, right up until she didn't need to be anymore. The first time I noticed something off was a Thursday afternoon when I stopped by my mother's house and found a real estate agent walking through the back rooms with a measuring tape. The agent seemed surprised to see me. I asked my mother about it later. She said Carol had arranged it, that they were just getting an idea of value, that it was nothing to worry about. I told Carol that evening I'd prefer she run these things by me first. She said, "Walter, I'm just trying to help your mother plan ahead." She said it the way you'd explain something to a child who'd interrupted an adult conversation. I let it go. That was my mistake, repeated over and over across those 4 years. I let it go. Not because I was naive, not because I trusted Carol completely. I let it go because I was watching. I was being careful. I was building a picture, piece by piece, the way I had been trained to do, and I needed the picture to be complete before I did anything with it. My mother was still living in her house. My mother was still safe, and I needed to be certain before I moved, because in my experience, moving too soon destroys everything you've built. I told Carol once, just once, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning, that I knew she had moved money from my mother's joint account into a separate account. I said it calmly. I said I needed to understand why. Carol looked at me with an expression I can only describe as practiced patience and said, "Walter, your mother asked me to. She doesn't trust herself with money anymore, and she asked me to manage it. If you have a problem with that, take it up with her." And then she poured herself coffee and changed the subject, and I stood there and let her, because what I had was not yet enough, not for what I needed it to be. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 38, lives in Richmond, works in hospital administration. She and I have always been close in the way that two reserved people can be close not through long conversations but through an understanding that runs underneath words. Or so I thought. When Carol began telling Renee that I had been checked out for years, that I had left the financial management of the family entirely to her, that my mother's arrangements were made with my full knowledge and approval, Renee believed her. I know this because Renee started calling less. And when she did call, there was a careful distance in her voice, a way of choosing words that told me someone had been working on her for a while. I didn't confront Renee about it. I know that seems strange. A father whose daughter is pulling away would naturally want to correct the record. But I had learned, in the years I spent investigating people who were very good at lying, that confronting the people who have been misled is almost always the wrong move. They become defensive. They double down. The person doing the misleading uses the confrontation as evidence of instability. Carol would have said, "See what I mean?" He gets paranoid, and Renee would have believed her a little more. So I said nothing to Renee. I kept my distance. I let Carol's version of events sit unchallenged, and I documented everything. My mother died on a Wednesday in March. She went peacefully, which I am grateful for. I sat with her for the last 3 hours and held her hand and talked to her about the house in Charlottesville, about the garden she kept in the 1980s, about my father, who had been gone for 19 years. I don't know how much she heard. I like to think she heard enough. The week after the funeral was when Carol told me about the will. Not the original will. My mother's original will, drawn up in 2014, left the house and the bonds and the savings account split equally between me and a trust for Renee's children. Clear, simple, what my mother had always said she wanted. The will Carol told me about was dated 14 months before my mother's death. In it, my mother had appointed Carol as executor. In it, the house was to be sold, and the proceeds placed into an account managed by Carol for family expenses. The bond portfolio had already been liquidated, Carol informed me. The savings account had been transferred. Everything had already been taken care of. I looked at her across the kitchen table and I said, "I see." Carol waited. I think she expected more. I think she expected the parking meter to finally express something. I said, "Thank you for telling me." She left the room. I sat at the table for a long time, and then I made a phone call. I want to explain something about the call I made. 14 months before my mother died, 14 months before, when it had become clear to me what Carol was doing and why, when I had enough of the picture assembled to understand its dimensions, I had contacted a former colleague, not a friend, exactly. A woman I had worked alongside for 6 years, someone I trusted, who still worked in federal financial oversight. I had sent her a package of documents, account statements, notarized signatures that had not been witnessed by anyone I could verify. Transfer records, a power of attorney document that my mother had signed during a period I knew, from her medical records, corresponded to a significant cognitive decline. I had sent all of it, and then I had waited. The call I made the week after the funeral was simply to ask if anything had moved. She told me it had. What I did not do, for the next 4 months, was tell Carol any of this. I went to work in the garden. I watched the news. I drove to Richmond twice to have dinner with Renee, who was pleasant but guarded, who still had Carol's version of me sitting somewhere in her mind like a splinter. I did not remove it. I waited. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday in July. An estate mediation, arranged through an attorney Carol had retained. The stated purpose was to formalize the transfer of assets and settle any outstanding questions about my mother's estate. Carol had told Renee it was a formality. Renee had told me, in a voicemail, that she hoped I would cooperate and not make things more difficult than they need to be. I drove to the attorney's office on a Tuesday morning in July, and I wore the same gray jacket I had worn to my mother's funeral. I got there early. I sat in the waiting room and I read a magazine about home renovation that I had no interest in, and I was calm. I am always calm when I know what is coming. It is one of the only useful things about being the kind of person I am. Carol arrived with her attorney, a man named Griffith. Sharp suit, 40-something, the kind of lawyer who has learned to project certainty as a professional courtesy. He shook my hand firmly. Carol sat down across from me and did not quite look at me. The mediating attorney, a woman in her late 50s named Mrs. Alderman, opened the file and reviewed the terms Carol's side had submitted. The house, the liquidated bonds, the savings account transfer. All properly documented, she noted, all appearing to be in order. And then she looked at me and asked if I had reviewed the materials. I said I had. She asked if I had any questions or concerns. Before I could answer, Carol's attorney leaned forward slightly and said, "I think it's worth noting for the record that Mr. Walter has been largely uninvolved in his mother's financial affairs for a number of years. These arrangements were made with his mother's full knowledge and consent, and my client has been the primary caretaker and financial manager of the family's affairs. Mr. Walter's role has been," he paused, searching for the word Observational. Carol nodded in confirmation. I said nothing. Mrs. Alderman looked at me. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite read. She looked down at her file, then back up at Carol's attorney. Before we proceed, she said, I need to ask one question. Griffith gestured openly, welcoming. Mrs. Alderman said, Mrs. Carroll, are you currently licensed to operate as a financial fiduciary in the state of Virginia? The room was very quiet. Griffith said, That question isn't really. Mrs. Alderman held up one hand. She was looking at Carol. I'm asking because the documents submitted to this mediation list you as acting fiduciary for the estate, and I want to confirm that status for the record. Carol said, carefully, I was acting in a family capacity, not a professional one. Mrs. Alderman nodded slowly. She said, and you were also acting as executor under a power of attorney obtained in October 2 years ago. Is that correct? Carol said yes. Mrs. Alderman opened the file in front of her to a specific page. She turned it so Griffith could see. His expression did not change immediately. It changed in stages, the way ice cracks slowly, then all at once. This office received a formal notification 3 days ago, Mrs. Alderman said, from the Federal Financial Oversight Division, regarding an active inquiry into asset transfers associated with this estate. She looked up at Carol. The inquiry has been open for 14 months. I sat still. I had known about the inquiry. I had not known it would surface here, in this room, on this Tuesday morning. My former colleague had not told me the timing. I suppose she had her reasons. Carol's face went a color I don't have a good word for. Not pale, exactly, emptied. Griffith asked for a recess. Mrs. Alderman granted it. In the hallway, I stood by a window that looked out onto a parking lot, and I watched a woman try 3 times to parallel park a gray sedan. She got it on the 3rd try. I found that satisfying. Renee had come to the mediation. She had been sitting to my left the entire time, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. When we moved to the hallway, she came and stood next to me. She didn't say anything at first. We watched the parking lot together. Then she said, 14 months. I said yes. She said, you've known for 14 months. I said I had. She was quiet for a moment. I could feel her working through it. Renee has always been methodical, a trait she got from me, which Carol had always found maddening in both of us. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. I thought about how to explain it. The work I had done. The files, the contacts, the long discipline of building something correctly instead of building it fast. I thought about all the times I had sat in rooms and said nothing and been mistaken for someone who was absent, when in fact I was more present than anyone else in the room. I said, because you needed to be safe. She looked at me. I looked at the parking lot. If I'd told you, I said, Carol would have known. And if Carol knew, the documents would have moved, the accounts would have been emptied further, and there would have been nothing left to document. I needed her to believe I wasn't paying attention. Renee said, she told me you'd checked out, that you hadn't cared about Grandma's finances for years. I know, I said. I believed her, she said. Dad, I know, I said again. It's all right. She put her hand on my arm. I put my hand over hers. We stood there at the window. The inquiry, when it formally concluded the following spring, found that Carol had transferred approximately $340,000 from my mother's estate through a combination of a revised power of attorney, 2 accounts opened in my mother's name during her cognitive decline, and the liquidation of bond assets that were not hers to liquidate. The revised will was determined to have been signed under conditions inconsistent with the signatory's documented mental capacity at the time. The original will, my mother's real will, was reinstated. The house in Charlottesville was not sold. I drive down twice a month and sit in my mother's kitchen and drink coffee from her percolator, which still works. There are photographs on the refrigerator from the 1970s, my father in a plaid shirt, my mother young, in a way I always forget she was. I sit there and I think about the garden she kept and the bonds she collected and the careful life she built, and I'm glad it still exists to sit inside of. Carol retained her own attorney by October of that year, separate from Griffith, who had withdrawn from the matter. I had moved out of the house in August. I didn't make a scene. I packed 2 bags, took the coffee maker I preferred, left everything else. I said, on my way out the door, I hope things improve for you. I meant it. Anger is exhausting, and I am 63 years old, and I have better things to do with what's left of my energy. The divorce was filed in November. It was not contentious, given the circumstances. Carol's ability to contest anything had been considerably narrowed by events. What I want to say, and I have been thinking about how to say this, is something about the nature of being quiet. People confuse quiet with passive. They assume a man who doesn't raise his voice has nothing to say. They assume a man who doesn't react is a man who doesn't notice. For 31 years, I designed structures that had to stand under pressures most people never think about: wind load, soil shift, the slow movement of water through concrete over decades. You learn, doing that kind of work, that the things which last are not the things built loudest. They are the things built correctly. I was not quiet because I was afraid. I was not quiet because I had given up. I was quiet because I knew what I was doing. And I knew that the moment I stopped being quiet, everything I was building would collapse. My daughter called me on a Friday night in February, about 6 months after the mediation. She'd had a glass of wine. She said, "Dad, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Were you ever going to tell me what you were doing? Or were you just going to let her keep?" She stopped, started again. "I keep thinking about how you sat across from her in that room and you just sat there. How did you do that?" I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the training I'd had a long time ago, and the discipline of it, and the years of practice, and my mother's hands that last afternoon, cold and thin, and the measuring tape I'd seen in her back bedroom 4 years ago, and the patience I had needed to save anything worth saving. I said, I knew what I knew. Renee was quiet on the other end of the phone. Then she said, "She called you useless." I remember. She used to say that you were just there, taking up space. I said, "She wasn't entirely wrong about the taking up space part. I was always there." Renee laughed. It was the best sound I had heard in a long time. The house in Charlottesville needed some work on the back porch. I drove down in March and spent a weekend replacing 2 boards that had rotted through. I used cedar, which lasts longer than pine and handles moisture better. You pay more for it up front, but it's worth it over time. I have always believed this about most things: the work that takes longer, the patience that costs more, the silence that looks like nothing but is, underneath, everything. I sat on the repaired porch that Sunday evening and listened to the neighborhood go quiet, and I thought about my mother saying, as she always had when she watched me work on something, "Walter, you do things so slowly." And I always said the same thing back to her. I said, "I do things right."